Since the beginning of this podcast, almost 100 episodes ago, I have been mining my 30-year Superman fandom, starting with that tattered red cape, within the larger context of the character's rich 85-year mythology, examining, discovering, and reconsidering the creative visions that have shaped the last son of Krypton. Now, our milestone 100th episode beckons, and the journey continues. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Electric Til 1 Million Part 2. And joining me to discuss the Electric Superman saga is one of the hosts of the Dollar Bin Bandits podcast and a returning guest, Joe Marcello. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you. This is our big blockbuster event as we revisit the Triangle era. Last week, I had Bernie here, and we talked about essentially the first half of 1997 in the Triangle era. So we started with that power struggle arc where Superman had to get his powers back after losing them in Final Night. Of course, they threw him in the sun, solved all his problems, as it always does. And then we followed the Man of Steel as his powers started to change, as he started demonstrating these energy capabilities and was losing his physical form. And Emil Hamilton and Kitty Faulkner and Contessa, they all worked together to create this containment suit that gave birth to Electric Superman, kickstarting a somewhat infamous period in the character's history. And now with you, we are going to look at the second half of 1997 and the very beginning of 1998, stopping just short of the point where Superman splits into red and blue. That will be the subject for a later episode, so we're getting there. And in a moment, I'll give the layout of all of the issues that we read. I'll give the rundown of the titles and numbers, and we'll talk about the specifics, of course. But I'll start with the big picture question, the same question that I posed to Bernie last week, because I'm always curious, but especially when we're talking about something like Electric Superman. What was your original reaction to this change in the status quo when it was originally happening back in the day? And then with now the benefit of time and distance and perspective, knowing how it all turned out, how have you typically viewed this story in retrospect?
Initially, at the time when this was about to come out, I was very excited for it because, one, I was in college at the time, and comics were my thing to kind of escape from everything else. So I would, just on my downtime, I'd be reading comics, and that's how I escaped everything. Heard about this, and I was excited because I was like, cool, I'm on the ground floor. I can get in on a major comic event, because the only major comic book event prior to this was the death of Superman. That happened before I was in comics and I was catching up. So I was very excited. When it came out, I got the glow in the dark issue. Years later, I got a signed version of it. So I was very excited for it. And I remember getting into it and I was like, this is neat, but I wanted more. Like it seemed like it fell a little flat for me. They dragged out a lot of it, that probably they could have really just kind of hammered it home, like with maybe one or two issues, like him getting used to his powers. Like, I think you could have just had one or two issues for that, rather than sprinkling in little nuggets of it. Oh, well, I can't really do that. I hope I can phase in time, that type of stuff. Looking back, I thought it was a, dare I say, a dark period in the Superman lore. So, and again, the same thing happened when he split. I was like, oh, I thought they were going to lean into the personality aspects that they at least told us about more so than they did. So, they could have, I think, go a lot deeper with what they had, but they chose not to for some reason.
In terms of what you just said and the little bit that we touched base about before I hit record, I think we're similarly aligned in terms of how we're coming into this episode, because I definitely had, I guess, somewhat of a moment of realization as I was making my way through this 28 issue reading assignment, where I was like, I'm enjoying myself overall, and I'll give my overall assessment and everything. But I definitely got to a point where I said, I kind of see where this went a bit awry, and why maybe it garnered the reaction that it did, and has occupied the place that it has since then. Like I could kind of see, and I sort of had that moment where I said, oh, I think this is the issue that I'm having with it. So it'll be interesting to talk about all of this. And on that note, let me share with our audience the issues that we read for this. And of course, I always put them in the show notes as well, but I'll rattle them off here quickly just so everyone knows what we're talking about. So again, triangle number wise, we're talking about the second half of 97, first few issues of 98. But in terms of the actual series, Superman 126 to 131 by Dan Jurgens and Ron Frenz, Man of Steel 70 to 76 by Louise Simonson. Scot Eaton filled in as penciler for most of those issues. We had John Bogdanove for a couple of them as well. Action Comics 735 to 741, primarily by Dave Michelinie and Tom Grummett. Michelinie would leave towards the end of our reading assignment, and Stuart Immonen would shift over to Action Comics, taking over as writer and penciler. We also had Adventures of Superman 548 to 554, primarily by Karl Kesel and Stuart Immonen. After Immonen moves over to Action Comics, Tom Grummett shifts over to Adventures, and we have the Kesel-Grummett pairing again. And we also had one issue of the quarterly Man of Tomorrow title. That was number 9 by Roger Stern and Paul Ryan. So that's what we covered for this reading assignment. Not unlike last week's episode. Last time we like I said, we had that power struggle arc, which was a clearly delineated storyline with chapter numbers and everything. But with the exception of that, there weren't these big tentpole event storylines. Of course, everything falls under the umbrella of this Electric Superman saga, but we didn't have things like the trial of Superman and the death of Clark Kent. And that continues here, even more so. I mean, we definitely have a ton of subplots and everything that sort of, weaves throughout. And we do have a few multi-part stories, but not to the level of these real, really, clearly delineated storylines. So you're really just immersed in the supporting cast and the world of Metropolis for these issues, right?
Yeah, and you know what? I'm fine with that. I would much rather just be in a comic series. I don't need major build-ups to make, as long as they're good, of course. I don't need a big event. I would much rather have a good story arc within a series rather than building up to something big and another tie-in or something to that effect. Although there was one in this, the Genesis, I don't know, what do you want to call that?
If it was one of those 5th week events, a la 0 Hour or
Right,
Final
yeah.
Night, right? And I mean, how well I did not reread the core Genesis miniseries. I definitely read it back in the day. I don't remember it particularly fondly, to be honest. I don't remember hating it or anything like that. But out of those ones I just mentioned, 0 Hour really stands out. Final Night
Right.
remains very near
Yes.
and dear to me. I love that one.
Yes.
The Genesis one, I really could kind of take or leave. So I did not revisit that one. But yeah, we did get 3 issues of the Superman titles that tied into that. So we did have that business
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah, it didn't, the only thing that really I liked about that series back in the day is that, you had the new gods, and, anytime you kind of get them included, I like those because they are characters that they didn't traditionally break out frequently. Certainly not now. So anytime you did, it kind of meant that something bigger was occurring. And I guess at the time it was more discussion around the source wall and, its place in the DC universe at the time. So, yeah.
Yes. No, very true. I echo what you said. I'm totally okay with not having these huge event storylines. And
Yeah.
let me start with the positive here, because honestly, the thing that I enjoyed most about this reading assignment is something that I've said in virtually all of our Triangle era episodes, because I really do think this is what sets this period apart. And that is the use of the supporting cast, the subplots, and this very lived in world of Metropolis that I feel it creates for us. There are certain points here, for example, when Lex is trying to sort of distract the public from his upcoming trial, and he pulls some strings to get Bibbo Babowski's championship fight moved up, right? So all of the attention will be on that. And you have Jimmy Olsen teasing this big Superman story, this big piece of information that he's going to reveal. We know that he thinks he's discovered Superman's secret identity, and of course that all falls apart for him. That's a big part of these issues. But there are a lot of these things going on, and we're checking in with a lot of the the main settings and characters within the world of Metropolis. And again, it just felt like this very lived in world. And when you were on the show, for the last time we did one of these big events, I think one of the episodes we did, we touched on, the battle for Metropolis and fall of Metropolis and some of those bigger storylines where I felt like at that time, some of this kind of got lost in the shuffle because there was so much going on. So the fact that we can spend the time with the characters, that to me was a highlight. So yeah, I was fine not having these big storylines, and I really just felt like I was pulled into the world, and that's where I feel like this era is always at its best.
Yeah, so rereading this, I would characterize this as very typical, and I will air quote this, very typical and basic Superman / Metropolis, because we're dealing with, like you said, the same settings and people that we have dealt with very frequently over the past, and as I say over the past, meaning, as it pertains to these stories, past few years. Bibbo, Lex, Jimmy Olsen, his career struggles. Lori Lamaris makes an appearance again. And these are all reoccurring, very basic, typical Superman characters and settings. Whereas now, I say now meaning current comics, that's all been blown up, and none of that really applies anymore. So it's very appropriate for the time, when these came out. So
Yeah, absolutely. It's why I think I always feel most at home when we're here in the Triangle era. So, that was really a big highlight. Plot wise, we'll unpack a lot of this, but as far as some of the adversaries that Superman goes up against, we have the return of Savior, which you reminded me we talked about the last time, or one of the last times you were on the show.
And yeah, the time before that as well, I believe.
Like I said to you off mic, I said, man, I wish I could say that I really had mapped this out and had you back specifically here for that reason, but it just worked out beautifully. So that's great. So we have the return of Savior. We have another iteration of the Superman Revenge Squad, who we learn is being organized by Morgan Edge. We have this monstrous creature, Ripper, who is abducting and eating and killing children. A very gruesome storyline. And, in the past, of course, we talked about the death of Cat Grant's son at the hands of Toyman. It's like, oh, wait, you don't need to, I really felt like maybe we could have gone in a little bit of a different direction here. That was a little bit much, I thought. But we do have that. Parasite is part of this Revenge Squad. Michelinie makes an appearance. So, those are some of the adversaries that he's going up against. Supporting cast-wise, I would say the two who I think have the most significant arcs and who I certainly enjoyed following the most were Jimmy and Lex. And it's really interesting to see them going in opposite directions, because over the course of these issues, we see Lex really reassert himself. We see him beat the charges against him, welcome baby Lena, overthrow Contessa from their marriage and from her role as the head of LexCorp. We see him physically beat the crap out of the new head of Intergang, Boss Moxie. Yeah. There's a lot with Lex as he sort of reassumes his position of prominence in Metropolis, whereas on the flip side, we see Jimmy Olsen really fall from grace from his position as Mr. Action at GBS, to the point where Intergang runs him out of town as they think he knows who Superman is. And then he has this crazy adventure in the wild area with Scorn and Ashbury and Misa from the Harrys. There's a lot going on there, but I feel like the two of them, they really get a lot of play going in different directions. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I mentioned Scorn and Ashbury. Those are two supporting cast members. We started talking about them in the last episode when they were introduced. Scorn being Saratak, this Kandorian prince who makes his way to our world, and for a time dons the classic garb of Superman and positions himself as a hero inspired by the Man of Steel. In these issues, he abandons that costume and just kind of starts doing his own thing. But he partners up, so to speak, with Ashbury, the high school daughter of Dirk Armstrong, the resident conservative at the Daily Planet. These two characters get a lot of play, and I said in the last episode that one of the things I was sort of going to be tracking as we make our way through this part of the Triangle era is it too much with them? Do they wear out their welcome? Are we stretching the supporting cast too thin at the expense of Superman? I don't want to rehash that whole episode, but you might even remember this. There was an issue of Wizard, and since that last episode, I realized is the first issue of Wizard I ever bought. It was 86, I think, 86 or 87. It's Hulk on the cover.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an article called Clark Kent, and it was the Wizard staff taking down the Superman books, everything that they thought was wrong with the Superman books. And one of the things they felt the supporting cast had gotten too sprawling and that the books were too crowded and that Superman himself was kind of getting lost in the shuffle. So we talked about that last time, but I can't help but have that on my mind as I'm reading these stories. And so I want to ask you, not to make Scorn and Ashbury the sort of the lightning rod for all this, but I feel like they represent, if this is a problem, I feel like they are a representation of it. So where do you land on the supporting cast, but specifically those two and their role in the books?
I'm glad you asked, because I distinctly remember when I originally read these back in the day that I always felt that they spent way too much time on these characters. Like I would, there was, especially since like Scorn was on the cover of way too many of these. So I would always say to myself, like, why do they keep bringing this character back? Like, it's not like this character was needed some major redemption. It just, it didn't really jive with me. And I'm not a fan of the whole, like, not speaking type of thing. And then he speaks broken English and, me find this type of thing. I'm like, okay, so are you like a Bizarro replacement for the time being? Because you could just do that. Like, I'd rather see like Electric Bizarro, that would be something. But yeah, both of them, I mean, of course, I bumped into it a little bit when I was younger, more so now, because like, if these characters are going to go on to bigger and better things, that would make sense. But we're just spending way too much time on characters that never went anywhere.
Very much so. And I read ahead a little bit because I was curious. I was like, what the hell ever happens to Scorn?
Right.
And he disappears off panel. There's a later issue of Action Comics, and I think it's 750. I think it's the anniversary issue that Stuart Immonen does. And I think it's in this issue. I mean, we'll get to it in one of our later episodes, but essentially, I think like Ashbury gets into some trouble at school, and sort of a lot of this kind of comes to a head. The fact that she's running around with Scorn all the time, and Scorn overhears like her father and teacher and Ashbury talking. And then it's either in that issue or a later issue where she confronts her father because she's like, look, Scorn left this note. And that's like the last we ever see of him. So he just kind of, it really does kind of fizzle out. And now, after all of the various reboots that we've encountered, who knows if this character even exists? He came from a very different version of Kandor at a very specific time in the publishing history, right? When Kandor was a very different entity.
Yes, exactly.
But I'm with you. I said this last time. I was like, if it was a matter of, hey, we want to have the classic costume around for a while after Superman's change, it's like I think I used the example of Eradicator or something like that. I think Bizarro is another great example. It's like there are other ways to sort of serve this function.
Yeah, and he didn't really bring a whole lot to the story. It wasn't a very compelling character, I didn't think, at least. Certainly not for the amount of time that they kept him around.
I think what I kept bumping into with this whole storyline, and the two of them in particular, was probably a little bit more of the Ashbury of it, because I feel like with the two of them, and I know it's going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because I was just like, oh, I love the supporting cast in this world of Metropolis, but to a point, and I feel like these two characters are too tangential. They are too
Hmm.
removed from our core Lois, Clark, Jimmy, Perry, Lex cast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Scorn is one thing, and he comes from that world of Candor. Okay, I still agree with your assessment of the character, though. I think there's only so much mileage you can really get, and we got it right. He came
Yeah.
out, and there's that initial confrontation, and then he's inspired by Superman and follows his lead, and I don't know that there's so much more farther to go at that point. But with Ashbury, she's the daughter of this relatively new colleague at the Daily Planet. It just feels like it's a little bit too far removed. The other thing was, this was a very curious choice to me. Why did they make her a child, essentially? Why did they make her underage? Because this whole thing has a very like Beauty and the Beast vibe to it.
Hmm.
And it just adds this whole, just sort of odd factor to me, right? Of the fact that she's this high school student, maybe she's like 16 or 17 or something like that. And she's running around
Yeah.
with this monster. And, like they keep making mention of the fact that she's underage.
Right.
And not that, I mean, from what we read, we don't actually see an actual romance. And from what I remember, I don't know that they ever get that far in subsequent issues. But again, it kind of has that feel to it. And I just sort of wonder why, like, why invite that? Why make
Right.
that a part of this?
So I absolutely agree with you. And the only thing that I thought of as I'm reading it is maybe there was someone behind the scenes saying, "Hey, we could, if there's enough of a buzz on these characters, we could spin them off, like keep them together in their own story, and make that story, for another group, another market of fans, that it may be appropriate for, because like you have that not necessarily Beauty and the Beast, but you have that child with the not father figure, but the her muscle being
Right.
Scorn, and they're fighting they're like the Scooby Gang, trying to solve mysteries or something to that effect. That's the only thing I could really think of that would warrant having these two characters together for so long. Like, I got it. Go to let's run with this.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair speculation. And maybe that was somewhat of the hope. I don't know. I think that there are one or two fixes that I think would have solved a lot of this for me. Number one is, had Ashbury been in college, because that's still a young person. She's blind
Hmm.
as well. That's the other angle here that her father mentions a lot, right? So he's
Right.
overprotective. Her mother had passed away, so there's a lot kind of going on in their family dynamic. But I feel like kind of making her a college student. She's still young, right? She would he would still be in that protective mode, but it sort of
Hmm.
takes that one kind of potentially like icky component out of it. So
Right.
I
And
feel
the
like
fact,
that's
yeah,
yeah.
if she were in college, then she's at a point in her life where she's supposed to be spreading her wings and having a little bit more freedom to to go out into the world. So it would only make sense. Whereas if she's the age that she's at here, then she's supposed to be protected by her parents. She's supposed to be under that parental blanket, of protection. So to be scooting around with a creepy monster thing, it doesn't really make sense.
The other thing that I was thinking of, and I had this idea when Lucy Lane made what I believe was her only appearance in the batch of issues that we read. This could have been a Lucy thing. And I think that would have
Yeah.
solved my other problem with this, which was that Ashbury just feels too far removed from our core cast here. Whereas you use Lucy and it's like, okay, now we have a much clearer connection point. And,
Hmm.
and I feel like this, I don't know, for my purposes, I think it would have worked better. I still think, a little Scorn goes a long way. I still don't know that I would have needed to spend as much time with the character as we did, but
Yeah.
I feel like that might have been a way through this that would have been a little bit smoother. But again, it's
Yeah.
easy to Monday morning quarterback this over 20 years later. But again, just kind of like some curious. I just feel like there were some curious choices made there, and I
Yes.
don't know. But to your point, yeah, maybe there was somewhat of a hope that look, this was a period of time. We had 5 ongoing Superman titles. We also had Supergirl. We also had Steel. We had Superboy. Like
Right.
there's a lot going. So maybe there was hope for us, Scorn
Yeah.
and Ash spinoff.
Yeah. Yeah. The Batman family has gotten big. They want to build up the Superman family too. So,
Yes. I think what Oh, while we're on the subject of Scorn and Ash, and we follow them. They're hiding out in the abandoned pool at her school for a while. She brings him to school later on to help plan the homecoming dance, and then you kind of get everybody's reaction. That dance ultimately ends up happening at a hotel through a connection of one of the classmates, and then there's this big explosion. But like she brings him there as her date, and so we follow them a fair amount through this. But there's one issue, and this kind of, I'm jumping around here, but I feel like this is a good point to talk about because I want to get your take. I'm like, I don't know what to make of this. This is after the Genesis tie-in, and during the Genesis crossover in the Superman books, Superman encountered Cyborg Superman yet again by the Source Wall, and unbeknownst to Superman, Hank Henshaw hitched a ride back to Earth through the circuitry of Superman's containment suit. So in one of these Scorn and Ashbury issues, there's this new teacher at school. Real nice, looking out for Ashbury, but he's got kind of an axe to grind about Superman. He's like, the school's making you guys do this assignment, talking about how great Superman is. He's not that great. He's this alien. And everyone's kind of like, what's with this? What's going on? He's usually so nice, this guy. Like, what's got him riled up? And the big twist, sorry to spoil it for everyone, is that the teacher is actually the cyborg. He fashioned more of a human form for himself. And Superman intervenes and they battle, and Cyborg is seemingly destroyed. But as is always the case, he's not really dead. We see the little spark in the little statue of Cyborg that Ashbury keeps. So, of course, he'll come back. He always comes back. What was your take on the Cyborg of it all in that issue? Did it make sense to you?
No, but, I don't know why a character so hell-bent on killing Superman would make himself into a teacher. It didn't make, I don't know. It didn't really make sense to me. I mean, this is a character that destroyed, an entire city, helped destroy Coast City, took over as Superman, harmed so many people, but then he's going to more or less reel himself in and pose as a teacher. So it didn't, I don't know, it seemed like a bit of a cop out, of a way to, bring the character back in. I mean, we just saw this character at the Source Wall, and he was more or less, he was like not necessarily embedded in it at that point. He was kind of making his way out on like a rock or something. So he's that, he's that powerful. So he's going to go from being on the quite literally the edge of space to being a teacher. So I don't know. It just seemed like a bit of a major stretch from one extreme to the other. So they could have made that character anyone else. That would have made more sense.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It really sort of took me out of it because I just felt it did not track with who we know Hank Henshaw to be. And yes, and
Yeah.
I had I'd forgotten this. You speak about Final Night in that Parallax one shot that came between issues 3 and 4 of Final Night, where we follow Hal Jordan before he shows up to help defeat the Sun Eater. He imprisons Hank Henshaw on the Source Wall. But then in this Genesis crossover, right, we find out that Henshaw was able to like transfer his consciousness to like the rubble near the wall, and so he's created this little, little floating home for himself right near the wall. Anyway, but this whole idea, because he says to Superman in that issue in the classroom, he's like, "All I wanted was to be normal." It's like, is that it? I mean, I know, yes, there was a lot of talk about, right, how he lost his humanity and Superman didn't save him and save, his wife and the other people on the crew, right, going back years now in the Superman books. And this disconnect from reality, right, where Superman's like, that's not what happened. I tried to help you.
Right.
But it just, I don't know. The notion that when given the option, Hank Henshaw would choose not revenge, not further death or destruction, but that he would just try to live this normal life as a teacher. It just, I don't know. That did not make sense to me. And then part of me is like, well, wait, if that's all, like, again, he can't be absolved for what he did. He killed millions, but it's just like, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. It just did not line up at all. And I had totally, I mentioned this last time. I'm at the point now rereading these issues where I have a clearer memory of them. Like I'm 10 now, back when these were originally coming out. It's like, now I remember them more.
Yes.
I had totally forgotten that one at like completely. So it was a surprise as I was reading it, and it turns out to be Henshaw. I'm like, wait, what? But that was such a weird one.
Yeah. I mean, he could, like you said, he wants to become normal or, live a normal life again, which he proved he quite literally can do. He just chooses not to because he's hell bent on domination or killing Superman or something to that effect. If he really wanted to do that, well, he did it. He just chose to snap out of it. So, I mean, he can go someplace else, anywhere else in the world. He can make himself look like a human and do that and go away, and you don't have to worry about it. But I still love that character. He's
So
one of my favorite, you know, don't break him out all the time, every once in a while to really like, pull him out at the last minute, like, oh, snap.
I will say, and we covered this last year, but in the Rebirth era, when Henshaw was part of the Superman Revenge Squad, and Superman ultimately, fashions a prison for him in the fortress and gives him one of the crystals that will allow him to sort of relive his memories of his life.
Yeah.
That was one of those instances where I'm like, wow, that's a kind of an ingenious way to sort of go about this. We've seen time and again, right? He can't be destroyed, right? He can't be imprisoned, but like this is a way of giving him some measure of peace, of closure, of maybe placating him, right? While he is still imprisoned. But and it also, of course, spoke to Superman's compassion, right? Despite everything that this guy has done, that he's still trying to find some way to help him reclaim his humanity. I thought that was such a great sort of twist on what we typically see, where it's the Superman's like, oh,
Yes.
he's gone. It's like, no, he's not. He's never
No, he's
gone.
never gone. Even when he was supposed to be actually be killed by the Anti-Monitor in Sinestro Corp War, or no, Blackest Night. I can't remember
Oh,
anymore. Um, yeah, he was supposed to be Anti-Monitor was going to kill him, and oh no, Sinestro Corp War because he was one of the Yellow Lanterns, and he's like, yeah, when this is all said and done, I'll kill you. And the last, his part of the of that story, his last panel is, supposedly he's dead, but it's just his head floating in space, and like the eye turns on and a tear trickles down the side of his face. And you're like, oh, he's not dead. So
I do remember that as you're recounting it. So, audience, look, if if you're, especially with respect to this, him posing as a teacher thing, if you're like, no, that tracks, like I think that makes sense for what the character wants, like please reach out, let me know. I don't know, maybe I'm off here, but it was such a an odd turn, I thought, in that issue. So, I think that maybe what compounded some of the frustration I was feeling with respect to Scorn and Ashbury and all of that is that in terms of what was going on with Superman at the time, and you alluded to this at the beginning here, it's a lot. It's a lot in these issues of him talking or thinking specifically in the thought
hmm
bubbles about how hard it is to have these new powers and describing exactly what he's doing every time he uses the powers. We get issue after issue of him lamenting the fact that he no longer has his super hearing or his x-ray vision and he has to go on
hmm
patrol. That's actually a great little twist. That shows how his life is harder. That's great. But it's said so many times and
yes,
we get so many explanations. Every time he's like, I'm going to have to extend my energy field or I'm going to have to go in materials. Like every time he's doing something, he's telling us. And I know it's new for the audience. It's new for the character. I get all of that. And I do also appreciate the fact that even though these books were working to tell a weekly story, there was no guarantee everyone was reading all the issues. So they had to give you enough in each one. And these were not necessarily meant to be binge read the way
hmm
we did for purposes of this episode. I recognize all of that. But the effect that it has, reading them one after the other, it's just like you get beat over the head with the use of his powers. And
right.
I think the problem I have is whether it's one time or 100 times, I don't know how interesting it is. I mean, where do you
It's
land on this?
it's not very interesting because it's if it were anyone else, like if it were Batman, if something were to happen to Batman, there would be one issue where he would just spend his time figuring it out. You know, he never just pauses. And when he does, it's to like cook breakfast and burn his stupid hand on a pot, and you have a whole new set of powers. Your quite literally your DNA has changed. Your body structure is different. Stop, take a beat, let's figure these powers out. I mean, your body is now, you have to contain it in a suit. So I think, if there was like an issue where he's just trying to figure it out, and like in Shazam in the movie when there's like a whole montage of him like trying to figure out his powers. Like that would be cool. Okay, how do I shoot electricity or do whatever and phase in and out, and rather than getting beat over the head with it, or just breadcrumb it throughout the through the story, it got tiring fast. So yeah.
It did. I wonder, like, are you a science guy at all? All right.
Yeah.
So I mean, I wonder if for you or for anyone out there who really is of the scientific persuasion, was this more interesting? Because I don't know. I don't know if you were really into this. If you're like, oh, like I love. The other thing too is I have no idea to what extent the science actually checks out. I did probably not.
Yeah.
But I don't know, because I wonder. Yeah, maybe there are folks out there who like loved hearing about what he was doing with his powers, but it just felt tiring. Is a great word. It also just felt like they were trying too hard. I said this last time. I do genuinely think the creators were well intentioned, and that they really latched onto this idea of, hey, and this phrase is used in the books, right? It's like learning how to walk all over again.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that, right? And you want to challenge the character in new ways. I totally appreciate that. But it just felt like they were trying too hard. It was like, look. Like the thing that he normally does, he can't do that. So he's going to show you how, he's going to tell you how he's doing it in a different way. And there's some cool things. There's an issue, I think it's with Jurgens and Frenz, when he has to land that plane, right? That's crashing, that's hurtling towards Metropolis. And he, like sears off the wings and he seals everything up and he creates the energy field and then he sort of like melts the ground and creates this like tar that it can slide into. That was great. Like there were some cool set pieces like that, but it's just, it was too much, and I just don't know that it was interesting enough to warrant that. And it just felt like so much of what his story was about. I mean, understandably, right? This whole era is his powers changing, but it's just like so much of it was about that, and it just got old. I was just like, I don't care.
I agree with you. It was the retelling of like his appearance in Metropolis in the comics. There was a plane in a crash, so he's going to go and save keep the plane from crashing. Well, it's the same thing. Now he just did it a different way. There are lesser characters in comics who have the similar power set as he did, who did it much better. So I think what they were doing could only last so long. Like you have to do it better. If you're going to have, like, they even had a character maybe a year or so later. There was a female
Strange
who had
visitor.
so who had the similar power issues, and she was wearing his outfit, and so she's like a, I don't know, second, third tier character, and it seemed like she handled it better than he did. It was like one issue, boom, in and out, gone. But it took him like a year and a half.
Yeah, and I referenced last time an interview that Jurgens gave on, I think, the 20th anniversary of this story, and he really stood by it generally, but did admit that he did feel it became unwieldy, and that they should have had sort of a clearer, I guess, arc, so to speak, or more clearly defined, chapters within this story. And I agree, and because I think I was pretty. I have to go back and listen to last week's episode, but I think I was pretty generous, and I think pretty positive about the beginnings of this.
Hmm.
But this stretch got a little rough. And I know this is really the end of this version of it, right? Next, he's going to split into red and blue for better or worse. And then we have Millennium Giants for better or worse.
Oh my
And then the traditional powers will be restored. I am kind of dreading the Millennium Giants thing. I'll be honest. I do not remember that fondly at all.
I don't either. And I just remember it like going on forever. And the only reason though I kept buying it is like, oh, these covers go together and they make giants. And I'm like, that's the only reason why I'm getting this, because the story was stupid.
I will say this though, is I thought it was so much longer than it really was, but I've been reading on the app, and in terms of the core Superman titles, I'll have to double check, but I swear it was just like 6 issues. But they had crossovers with Teen Titans, with Steel, so it did balloon.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna just read the core issues, and hopefully those half a dozen will go by relatively quickly. But
Yeah, it's I'm looking at them because they have them lined up here, and it's I remember it just feeling like forever. Maybe they just rearranged them differently or something, the way they're listed here, but there were 3 giants as I recall.
yeah,
And there was the head, torso, and foot. And so there were, I think, maybe 6 or 9, I don't know, issues, but you put them all together and it was Superman zipping across both red and yellow. But
yeah, we'll get there. That's not our next episode. I've spread these out a little bit, so after this one, we'll spend a little time. We'll see what else was going on in the world of Superman beyond comics, and also beyond the core Superman titles, because we also have the Grant Morrison JLA run. So that's one of our upcoming episodes as well. And that's, I think most people hold up Morrison's use of Electric Superman as probably the best that we got. And so I'm excited to get to that. But again, I mean, as far as the core titles during this period of just the Electric Blue, right? We've come to the end of it in terms of what we've read here. But, of course, you can't help but compare this to Death of Superman in terms of just these huge status quo shifting events in the character's life and publishing history. And it's just, you look at one and it did have, Death of Superman did have clear arcs, but it also had places to go. I think that was the other thing here, right? You kill Superman, you're dealing with the emotional fallout.
right.
What happens when he's not there? Who rises to take his place? How does he come back? There's a lot to do there. Here, I think this initial setup was solid, and you saw him struggle to deal with this new power set, and he gets the new suit, and I do think it's a cool look. People, have differing opinions on that, but it gets you to a place where it's like, okay, not quite sure where we're going, not quite sure how long this is going to last, not sure how I really feel about it, but it feels like there's an energy, no pun intended, like it's exciting.
Yeah.
But then I don't know, it's just, there doesn't really seem to be anywhere to go other than to just keep showing you or telling you. I think that's the problem. I think it was the telling that kind of got on my nerves, right? Because the golden rule, show, don't tell. And it was just a lot of him explaining what he was doing.
So I'm glad you mentioned that. And what I thought of this period of time in the comics, and by all means, please tell me if you think call me out on it, if it's nonsense or not. But it seemed like this period of time was very dumbed down. They're like you said, spelling everything out for you. I have to do this. Oh, I have to do that. I have to do that. The For the most part, the artwork was not as good as it had been in recent years or prior to it, I will say. Um, it didn't wow me. There were gimmicks in the covers, a lot of gimmicks. We had the head series. I forgot
Yes.
the reason for that, but um, all those, the main characters were front and center, which are
Including
cool.
Scorn.
Dude, I mean, whatever.
Scorn got one. All right.
Yeah. So I mean, it seemed like it was very tame. I mean, some of the stories, yes, obviously, with children being eaten, but it seemed like a very, I hate to use that term, but a dumbed down version of Superman storytelling.
I guess, yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe I agree to a point, but then it's like you look at what they did with Lex, and I feel like there was some really interesting stuff there. And was it issue
Yeah.
131 where Lena's born and Lex is narrating the issue? And I had mentioned this issue when we did one of our Lex episodes last year, but now I finally got to read it in its proper place in the Triangle era. And you have Perry and Lex talking about their shared history growing up in Suicide Slum, and
Hmm.
this is the issue where Lex has the mayor assassinated, and it turns out the assassin he hired was the former abusive foster parent he lived with, who killed little Lena, who was a fellow foster child who he had affection for. And after the foster father completes the job, Lex kills him. It's like, and it ends with this chilling moment, right, of Lex holding Lena, looking out over Metropolis. He's like, "This will be yours," as Contessa has been sedated and sequestered, right? So like, there's some good stuff that I would say is
Yeah.
not dumbed down. However, yeah, I mean, maybe in terms of, more generally speaking, and especially when it
Yeah.
comes to these
Yeah.
powers. And I love these creators and I love this period of time. It's like, I don't mean to dump on it, but, and I can appreciate too. It's like, they want to make sure people understand what's going on, what the powers are. They probably are trying to figure it out themselves too. It's like we talked in the last episode. There's one issue when they're in Kandor, and all of a sudden, Superman's using vision bolts, and it's like, where the f did this come from? Like it wasn't part of the equation. It's like it's just a different form of heat vision. What the hell is this?
Right.
And I don't think he used it again. So I think they were sorting out a lot themselves. Like I get all of that. On a positive note, I will say this: Clark contending with being human when he's not Superman. Yes, there's some silly stuff like you said when he when he burns his hands, taking the pot out of the oven. But there were a few instances. He's reporting on a story and there's a mining cave-in, and initially it's like, well, if I use my powers, I'll reveal myself. But then it turns out it's like with the gas that's down there, like any spark will cause it to ignite. So it's like if he electrifies, they're done. That puts him in a tough spot. There's another one where Intergang sets fire to Lois and Clark's building, and it's like he goes back in to protect his secret identity. Like he changes back to Clark so that he can come out, and then he ends up passing out from smoke inhalation, and another guy has to save him. And then when Lois is abducted by the same terrorist who had wrecked their honeymoon, right, when she's in Australia, and
Hmm.
Sam, Lane, and Clark have to go in to rescue her. And, Clark is saddled with Sam, right? And so he's got to do as much as he can as Clark to protect his identity. There were a few instances where and even stuff as mundane as, Lois kind of ribbing him for putting on some pounds
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
Clark. And another character mentions that as well. I was like, you're really dumping on this guy. And even, you see him trying to lift weights and he's like, he's practicing his form, right? Because he's never had to do it.
Right.
That stuff I thought was cool. What did
I
you like that?
I did, absolutely, because one, you hadn't seen it. It's never happened before. Other than like him being without powers, like in the past, but they never really touched on that. Not so much as they did here, certainly. The biggest thing you had to deal with back then was like his hair grew, and he can get a haircut now. And like, wow. Um, but I like that stuff. I mean, I joke about it, but it was more interesting. Like he's a regular person right now, and he has to experience all these things for the first time, and he's clearly like, oh wow, that's obviously he's felt pain, but on a such a mundane thing as taking out a pan from an oven or something like that, burning his hand, gaining weight apparently, which it seems like if you can alter your physical form, you could probably suck in your gut too, but whatever. But I find that, that's new and interesting. That's all new area that hasn't been touched. And, that's what made this part of this period interesting.
And you know what I think helps with that is that they were able to do more showing there
Hmm.
and not as much telling. It's like, yes, there is dialogue about, oh, you put on weight, or, oh, I gotta, I had to supinate my wrist, right? But uh, again, it just didn't feel like we were being told as much. And so I
Right.
think this works really well. And in both instances, whether we're talking about the new powers or being human as Clark, it's like, yes, it's challenging him in different ways. But I just think the Clark side of it is just vastly more interesting. And it's
Hmm.
his job at the Daily Planet, right? Like he can't type fast anymore. So it's like the
Right.
thing that was sort of his saving grace before. He could disappear, right? But he could file his stories lightning fast and get everything in. And it's like now
Right.
he's like sitting there. Like stuff
Crap.
like
Where's the
that.
P? I don't know where the P is. Oh, no.
Yeah, so like stuff like that, I really thought was enjoyable, and that added, I think, a fun wrinkle to the proceedings, way more than what sort of electromagnetic field he was extending all the time.
Yeah.
So I said this last time, I'll echo it again. I thought the Lois and Clark, the married dynamic, I really like that. I like the two of them now, really on the same team, partnered up. She's fully in his world. I thought that was great. We get the little bit of a wrench in the works with Simone, the new marketing consultant, who, of course, Clark had a past with. It's funny, though. At one point, Lois is like, "Oh, your ex-girlfriend," and he's like, "Well, it wasn't really like ex-girlfriend." It's like, buddy, I don't know that you're helping yourself here, but like,
Yeah, again, we touched on that last time. Like he sucks when it comes to like dealing with past relationships and communicating to his wife. I'm like, look, man, everything you've been through, I think you could just tell her and be like, cut me some slack, you know?
yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. So, yeah, that aspect, I think, more than anything else, was a strong point of this point. Speaking of the powers and the costume, a couple of things. One, in one of the earliest issues that you and I read, maybe even the first one. I think it is the first one. It's the one with where Superman is like slamming Lex against the desk on the cover, and that plays out in
Yes.
the issue as well. So the audience knows that the fabric, the micro fabric for the containment suit came from the Contessa, but apparently Clark doesn't until he reads Lois's article. And I guess I'm being nitpicky here, and I know Clark was off in Candor for a while, but it's like, well, this never came up. Like, it's like I would be if I were Clark, I'd be a little peeved. I'd be like, Lois, what the hell?
Well, the fact that he didn't know that and his wife did know it, like that just goes to show you like everything that happens in Superman world happens continuously. Like there's no room for breathing or anything. Like what we see is what happens like from issue to issue and panel to panel. So there's no like taking a moment to figure stuff out in between.
Fair. No, yeah, I think that's an accurate
And it's
read.
irresponsible.
Yeah, but at least he gets that bit of information, and still waiting to see where the other shoe is going to drop. Do you remember? I don't want to spoil it for myself, but there does come a point. There's some sort of trick or trap or something that they put in the suit. Is there something?
Oh man, I forget. I don't recall. Certainly it wasn't in this. If there was, it's not for a while, but I don't remember there being anything um maybe like a fail safe where he couldn't harm, like Contessa or something to that effect. Um like some type of fail safe like don't touch me. But no, I don't remember. It's that doesn't stick out in my head.
Yeah, I just have this suspicion that there's no payoff to this, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. We'll see. But that I did think that issue was solid, where Superman confronts Lex and he's like, "Listen, you've screwed with my powers before, right?" And we have instances of that from years
Hmm.
prior with the red kryptonite and things like that. So the fact that Superman thinks Lex is behind it makes total sense. I think led to a great confrontation between them. There's also, you mentioned the issue where Lori Lamaris leaves, and I'll say this. First of all, I'm glad that they at least gave her somewhat of a farewell as opposed to just dropping her, right? She at least
Yeah.
says, like, I'm going on this archaeological
Right.
expedition. It's like, okay, like at least we've acknowledged that she's not going to be around. And then that's the issue where, and this leads to the other big thing that I wanted to follow up from the last episode. In that issue, Clark is still approaching all of this as if it's a temporary setback, a temporary
Hmm.
change. And over the course of this issue, especially after he talks to Emil Hamilton, he comes to terms with the fact that this is permanent. Of course, we know it won't be, but at
Right.
least for purposes of the story at this point, he has a measure of acceptance. And I did like that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going into a major event or story and the character realizes it's temporary, then kind of doesn't matter. There's really no emotional connection to it. I think that if the character knows, well, this is permanent, this is not going, there's no hope, there's no change in sight, there's no going back, then this is going to be the status quo going forward, and I have to make do with it, and that's how it is. That way, the story's going to matter. So, I think it went, I don't know, what, a year and a half in the comics, something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a fair amount of time, real time. So, in comics world, that's, I don't know, 2 months,
Right.
something like that. But that's your characters, I think, need to really realize, like, this could be permanent, so I need to make do with it. So yeah.
So I read one of our patron questions last week, but I'm going to reiterate it now to just kind of update. But first, let me pose it to you, Joe.
Yes, please.
Can you can you summarize the origin of Electric Superman in a few concise sentences? How did he get these powers?
I'm glad you asked. I had to explain this to my 7-year-old. Okay. And I said the following: he lost his powers, he got thrown into the sun, but the sun was really, really too powerful for him, and it almost overloaded him. And as a result, screwed him up so bad that it changed his whole DNA. And as a result, he has to, his, I don't know, his DNA changed, and it couldn't be cohesive. So that's why he had to stick himself in a suit.
I wish that's what they had gone with. More I
I mean, that's the only way I could really make sense of it,
Okay. So I know obviously you haven't heard the episode that hasn't come out yet. So we talked about this in the issues leading up to the donning of the containment suit. Superman takes Lois to the fortress, and he makes reference to the fact that Tolos, right, that body snatcher who created the bottle
Yes.
city of Kandor, right, had tried to possess him and take him into the bottle city. And that after that attempt to take him to the bottle city between dimensions, that the fortress robots didn't recognize his DNA, right? And we there was a whole issue with that.
Yes.
So coming out of last episode, based on that reading, we sort of had our working theory was that this dimensional shift screwed him up somehow. And I said then that I remembered a conversation with Hamilton where Hamilton talked about some kind of energy wave. And I was like, but I couldn't, it wasn't in the last batch of reading. I was like, where is it? It was in the reading that we did for this. It was an issue of Adventures of Superman. And I'll post the panel or the series of panels here because I was like, oh, I remember from being a little kid. I still remember that when Hamilton laid this out. Okay, so I'll just read it where they're talking. Hamilton says, didn't you tell me you had a few odd experiences of being sucked into that bottled city? And Superman says, yes, twice. That's what changed my powers. And Hamilton says, not exactly, but I believe it left you extremely susceptible to an unusual energy wave I've detected. Now, you'll like this next part will raise your antenna, Joe. He says, I'm not quite sure of its genesis, but it appears to be at least global. Global. And that's, as far as I know, that's as much of an explanation as we ever get. Now, the use of the word Genesis, so close to that Genesis event, makes me wonder if, because that story dealt with like this whole God wave business.
Right.
I don't know. I don't think they ever make that connection clear or explicit, but at a minimum,
It makes sense though.
It seems that this dimensional shift into the bottle city, those attempts by Tolos to possess him, take him into the city, whatever happened there, that's what left him open to this energy wave that changed his powers. And for as much as I can remember, I genuinely think that's the most we ever get in terms of a clear, so to speak, explanation of all of this. I like your version better. I think that would have been cleaner. And it's also, obviously we're years away. Well, not that many years, crazy enough, but we're still years away from All-Star Superman. But, there we see the ultimate consequence of too much solar radiation. So the idea of, hey, yeah, the trip into the sun restored you, but there was this drawback to it. I think that would have just made a lot more sense.
Yeah. I mean, That's how I always thought of it, at least over the years. Um, and I think there have been retellings of Superman. Like, okay, so they had one in Man of Tomorrow, kind of a retelling of his life up until this point. And they've done, I always like those for some reason. I know the story, I know how it goes over the years, but I just love these little synopsis of his whole, life until up until now, those issues. And they always seem to do that every few years. Um, and as I recall, that's just how they seem to have explained it in the past. Lost his powers because of Final Night, try to get him back as a result of that. Now, of course, that happened a while ago, but now we're feeling the effects of it, and it overloaded his system. He changed, expelled some of the energy and became normal again. And Alex Ross painted, like that was that was the gist of it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm hanging on Emil's words too closely. I don't know, but
But that makes sense. What you said makes sense. I mean,
but I prefer your I mean, honestly, I really wish they had just and yeah, maybe again, I don't know. Maybe I'll keep an eye out for times when this is referenced after that, if that's sort of how they kind of tidy it up a little bit more neatly. I do remember. I guess I blocked out a lot of Millennium Giants, but I do remember that Superman Forever one shot where he's back in his typical form. And I remember him talking to
yeah,
Pa Ken, and it's like, he's at the end of Millennium Giants, and we'll get there, but like basically Superman, Red, and Blue have to expend all of their energies to defeat the Millennium Giants. And then he's restored to the Superman we all know and love. And he says something to Pa about like, oh, I think Earth rewarded me, like the planet like rewarded him for sacrificing himself. It's like, really? Like after all this,
hmm
that's what we're
yeah.
going with? It's like, all right.
And they never, ever, ever make mention of that ever again. Like, there are the death of Superman has been discussed, dare I say, ad nauseum ever since over the years. Now, the whole changing of his powers hasn't been discussed ever, or at least nowhere near as much. I mean, I don't remember it coming up. Maybe they did like in a recap or something like that. But, well, no, I take that back because I think there's like a current something going on currently where,
John Kent is getting the
yeah,
powers.
okay, I haven't caught up yet, but yeah, I mean, they're obviously addressing it. So
Yeah, so we'll see. And even when we get to, you mentioned that strange visitor character, we'll be touching on those issues in the final episode of this event. So we'll see sort of how it's addressed when we get to that point. But it's so I'll stop beating up on our poor creators here, but it's just it's just funny to me how where we want the explanation. Tell us how he got these powers.
yeah,
There, it's very nebulous, but it's like I could do without all the explanation about what he's doing in every issue to accomplish his super tasks. But that's where we get the exposition. So
yeah,
it is what it is. I will tip my hat to them. I did think it was cool when, especially the first time Electric Superman went up against Parasite, and he was able to siphon off all of Parasite's energy. And he's like, "How do you like
yes,
it?" And it's like, "I'm different now."
right,
Like that was a cool flip on what the dynamic
absolutely.
typically is. Like there's good stuff in here. There's
There
good stuff
definitely
in
is
here.
good stuff. Definitely good stuff. Him teaming up with Adam, I loved,
Yeah.
because I love that character. Even though this was a different version of the character. I think this was like a younger. Uh, was it Ray Palmer?
It was Ray. He had been de-aged in Zero
That's
Hour
what it
and
was.
he forgot a
Okay.
lot of the science he'd learned. So
Okay.
he was
Yeah,
having a
that's what
hard
it was.
time.
Had a fancy new outfit like many did back then. And I always enjoy that character. So the fact that he's like, I'm partnering with Superman. Hey, that was cool. And of course, the fact that he interacts with Batman was a fun issue as well.
I'm glad you mentioned. Let me circle back to that. I just want to say, because you mentioned that Man of Tomorrow issue where Ma and Pa recount
Yeah.
Clark's history. So, kind of looking at the cover frames the issue as, sort of a journey through Superman's different looks,
Yes.
right? And I think that's a great framing device for this. I would say what you get is has even more substance to it in the context of the issue, where they basically recount his entire post-crisis history
hmm
to that point. And yes, along the way, you see the War World garb that he
Hmm.
wore when he was in the arena
Yeah.
and so on. But you really get this summary now. Reading it now as an adult in 2023 who has now read the entirety of Post Crisis Superman, it's like, okay, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous that they would be having this, like that kind of conversation going through everything. But I remember that issue and it's still near and dear to me. And I was saying, there's so much value in an issue like that, especially then, because it wasn't like, oh, everything's collected and people can go on an app and read
Hmm.
everything digitally. You didn't have those opportunities necessarily to catch up on what you had missed. And
Right.
I remember, look, when I read that for the first time, I had never read that original, the storyline where Superman executes Zod and the other villains. I had never read Exile. I had never read
Right.
the Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite. I had never read
Hmm.
any of that. Like this was how I learned about a lot of this stuff. And so I really can appreciate the value of it, even if it's a little clumsy now. But it's one that I still look back on very fondly. I love that one.
I love those. I agree with you. I mean, they're um, for anyone who's new or people who are not new but kind of just need a reminder. I think those are fun issues. You do it well and creatively. I think they're great. Those and like the secret file issues.
Yes,
I was a sucker for those.
me too.
Just a sucker. I mean, the secret files. It's like just it's nonsense. It's a nothing issue, but all it is just have a cool picture of your character and a blurb of their backstory. I love those.
I know I was a big fan. I would, it's funny thinking back on it, I've sold them all now, but I would get secret files issues even for titles and characters I wasn't reading.
Yeah,
I, but
but
I guess it was good. It was like, at least it gave me some sort of context. Like there's value in that, right? So the
yeah,
next time they pop up in the Superman books, at least I know what their deal is.
it was I guess the updated version of Who's Who
Yeah.
something, which is just an absolute awesome book.
I'm glad that you mentioned that Batman issue with the
Yeah.
kryptonite ring, because that's an instance where I counter to what I said before, where I feel like a lot of the challenges that Superman's facing, especially as Superman, again, really all stem from having to figure out how to use these new powers. But this was a more philosophical debate that he was having, right? Where Lex is preparing his defense. He's demanding the return of the kryptonite ring to be studied. It's going to play a part in this defense that he's mounting against all of these legal charges, all these criminal charges. And, Superman has to decide whether to acquiesce and turn the ring over or not. And, there's this whole conversation that he has about how he's able to do what he does because the people trust him, right, to obey their laws and to play along, as opposed to Batman, the keeper of the kryptonite ring, who relies on fear and intimidation. And I love that interaction between them, where Batman's like, we know Luthor's guilty, like let him roast, and it's like, yes,
Yeah.
that makes sense coming from Batman, but of course, that's not Superman. And unbeknownst to Superman, Lex plays him, right? And he has this, uh, we think it's Lex's scientist who's observing the police department testing the ring, but really it's this international thief who switches them out. And so we end that issue and this run of issues that we're talking about with Lex
Mhm.
now in possession, once again, of the kryptonite ring. Though in the electric form, it doesn't affect Superman anymore, as we
Right.
learned. But I mean, what did you think about that issue and the conclusion that Superman comes to? Did it ring true? Did you feel like he should have followed Batman's advice?
Well, I think we all think that people should follow Batman's advice because that's what Batman is there for. He's telling everyone, he's speaking what everyone's feeling, but that Superman is never going to do that. Um, and the whole time, the few pages that Batman's in there, I'm hearing Kevin Conroy's
Me too. When I turn that page. When I touch the screen and the
Yeah.
and the page turn, I instantly went to
Yeah,
that.
and he's all silhouette. Except for maybe the one there. Yeah, there's the one panel where you see his mouth, but the whole thing is just black. Loved it. Um, yeah, I think I would love for just once in continuity because I know he's probably done it in Elseworlds versions or in Injustice video games. just do what Batman does. Just let him, like you said, let him roast. Let him, go to jail. Let him suffer or something. Um, because, that's what he deserves. And it would just be so badass. Because there's nothing that Superman really has to do. There's no powers. It's not like he needs to, like, rip a car apart. Just let him, suffer for all his misdeeds. So
Yeah. Well,
never
this
gonna
is a great
happen.
point, I think, to talk about the Lex of it all, because, like I said, I think Lex had one of the most interesting arcs in the stretch of issues that we read. I enjoyed it a lot, and a big part of it is, at this point, he's married to the Contessa. They've mostly kept that on the down low, but now,
Yeah.
word is starting to get out, and she's pregnant, so we know that's a baby's on the way. Uh, but yeah, a lot of this revolves around all of these charges, right? So at this point in the story, of course, Lex was dying of kryptonite poisoning. He went on this flight around the world, seemingly died, but of course, we knew, and the world would later come to learn that he had faked his death, and he had Happerson and his team of scientists grow him a new cloned body that they placed his brain in, and he then posed as his own son, his own Australian son, Lex II. And eventually, right, and you were on that episode where we talked about the battle for Metropolis and the fall of Metropolis, where all of this
Right.
kind of came to a head. That cloned body was deteriorating, and he was losing it, and he decided to take Metropolis out with him and launch these attacks, and the city was demolished, and he was left in this vegetative state, like just this shriveled body, right, in that chamber. And then in that Underworld Unleashed event, he made a deal with the devil, Neron, right, in the DC universe,
Right.
restoring his body. And then during the final night, so a lot of big stuff happens in these events. In the final night event, he returned, right, to public, to the public world, and offered his expertise in restoring the sun. So, when we kind of pick up with him here, people don't really know like what happened to him, right? Just that he's back, he's vital again, and he helped. But there are still all of these charges: the attempted murder of Sasha, his karate instructor from way back a few years earlier, and of course the attempted, or not attempted, the destruction of the city. So all of that is kind of coming to a head. What did you think about the way the trial, or not even the full trial, it was just like a pre-trial hearing,
Right.
and the way he's able to get around all of this? What did you think about how that all played out?
Well, it's typical Lex type stuff. I'm not surprised. Um again, like I kind of figured like, oh well, that's what's going to happen. And if it were not to happen that way and something, he goes to trial and gets convicted, well then, something's going to happen at the last second where he's going to, you know, it, let me make a reference to you in current news. Okay? The Murdoch trials. Man's on trial. There's a bomb scare the same day that, he's in court. Very Lex Luthorish. Powerful man, okay, in a small town, has all the connections, and he's on trial, and something happens while that's going on. So, at any rate, that's what I thought of the other day. But yeah, I wasn't too surprised because it's it's like very typical Lex Luthorish type thing to happen, and you kind of know that he's going to get out of it in some way. I will say this about his interactions. I don't. I find Lex Luthor most imposing and scary when he's not worked up or angry. So there's a few panels where he's like, he's yelling and he's arguing, like whether it's at Superman or um, right before he gets into the limousine, they pull away uh, during that whole interaction about like the ring and everything like that, and he's all fired up. I don't like when he's yelling because it shows his weakness. So when he is cool, calm, collected, and he's got his plan buttoned up, I find that to be like the best Lex that there can be. Like when he showed up after, dying, and he's buffed out in his polo shirt and he's just totally chill. I'm like, that's it. That's Lex Luthor. So, you get either has like the black suit and the purple tie, or, some version thereof. So
Yeah, the cool, calm, collected Lex. There is something that is very imposing and chilling about that, right?
yeah,
It is far more
very.
effective, I agree, than if he's fired up. So essentially the way that he's able to beat the rap on this, and he enlists this top attorney, Drysdale, right? This top attorney on the East
Yeah.
Coast. And interesting arc for that lawyer, right? Because he's the one we talked about the scene where Superman, lands the plane, right? And the lawyer witnesses all of this and is very inspired by what Superman does. And we get the sense that he actually believes Lex's the concocted story that Lex comes up with, right, for his defense. Like the lawyer believes that, and then Lex, fills him in on everything after the fact, and it's like this guy like sold his soul, right, and he's just so demoralized. It's
Yeah.
like another life crushed by Luthor. But essentially, the story that Lex and his team present in court is that uh, he was dying of radiation poisoning, but it was Happerson, right, who went rogue and abducted him and subjected Lex to this, experimental revolutionary cure, right? And that in the meantime created this clone, and it was the clone who did all the bad stuff. And they parade this shriveled out,
Right.
maniacal cackling clone into the courtroom, and everyone is just taken aback. And pending DNA tests, the the judge feels that's enough to dismiss the charges. So they pin it all on Happerson, who Lex is taking care of, and this clone created expressly for the purpose of this courtroom appearance. It's kind of brilliant in its simplicity.
It
It
is.
was
I
the
mean,
clone.
when in doubt, whip out the clone.
Yeah.
I mean, it has become a very much of a comic book trope. Clones, variants, alternate versions of people. Um, I think they leaned into the clone stuff a little too much though in this period of time. Like, all right, that's enough with the clones. But then again, he clones Superboy, he clones Bizarro, and so
Yeah, a
it's his
lot of
thing.
clones just in these titles, let alone, of course, what was going on over in the Spider-Man books and even on
Right.
the Lois and Clark TV series with that whole clone arc, which we talked about
Oh
last
yeah.
year. So yeah, there was a lot of that, but it worked. I mean, it was one of those I don't know. And Mark Waid wrote that issue. He guest wrote that issue. I forget the exact title and issue number, but I thought it was very strong. It was just one of those things where it felt appropriate, right? Like it was sort of outlandish in all the best comic book ways, yet brilliant in its simplicity, and leaves you feeling kind of like frustrated on Superman's behalf, right? Like Lex didn't meet justice, but it also kind of made sense, right? That this would be
Yeah.
enough to cast enough doubt at least. So
Right.
I thought that played out well. And then, you see Lex making his moves. And in particular, we have this new version of Intergang. We at least mentioned them last time. I don't know how specific we got, but essentially Dabney Donovan, right? The rogue Cadmus scientist has been cloning these 30s and 40s gangsters, right? So they're running around
Right.
in new bodies with powers and they're running the town, and they kidnap one of Lex's. They've been stealing LexCorp technology, and they kidnap one of his scientists and set up an exchange. And Lex comes with his bodyguards who are quickly gunned down, and it's like Lex just standing there defenseless against Boss Moxie, right, the young clone body of this notorious gangster. And this is where. But I think this still tracks with what you said, right? Because it's not a matter of Lex yelling at him. Lex physically dominates him. And I feel like this is ultimately my preferred version, the initial post-crisis Byrne iteration of the character where he was less fit.
Hmm.
I think certainly made sense in terms of, what they were going for at the time. But I do like
Yeah.
the more imposing, more physically imposing Lex, because you get a moment like this where it's like, yes, he can outthink you, out strategize, outmaneuver. There's all of that. He can pay everybody off, but like when it comes to it, he can also kick your ass, and he does.
Right.
And I thought that was such a great sequence.
He is. He's a Batman.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, quite honestly, I mean, he has all the same. Well, I mean, I think that they've made this point. They're very similar lives. Both rich. They have all the resources at their disposal. Just one took a different path than the other. Um, and they're both physically imposing. I mean, I guess, obviously Batman more so, but when it comes down to it, Lex can hold his own in a fight. Um, he's got all the tech so he can make amazing suits and things like that. So, there's a lot of similarities there. But yeah, Lex is a very physical, imposing character when need be. He just doesn't need to be.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, I've spoken before about how No Man's Land got me into reading Batman comics and
Yeah.
remains one of my favorite Batman stories, and culminates in that showdown between them as Lex swoops in and tries to buy up Gotham, as the No Man's Land is ending, and it's like it makes perfect sense. Oh,
Yeah.
so good, and not too long after this, actually, at
Yeah,
all,
that's
a couple
right.
years,
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah, that's when I started getting into Batman more so at the time. That was a good series.
I think that's the thing. It's funny as we're talking about these Superman comics, as we're in, late 97 now, heading into early 98. It's like we're not that far removed. Again, the Morrison JLA stuff is running now. We're getting close to Batman No Man's Land. And even like I said, All Star Superman, what starts in 2005. It's like we're not that far away from these stories. It's
Yeah.
just kind of thinking about the context of it.
Yeah, and I remember so we got closer and closer to 2000, the year 2000 fears. So year 2000 is creeping up on us, and what does that hold, and why 2K was a thing, and at least as it pertained to Superman comics, we're like, okay, we're going to bring in Brainiac, and he's going to be computer rendered because that's going to be interesting, and it wasn't, but it was a cool version nonetheless.
Yeah, I will always have a soft spot for that Y2K story, but yeah, I even as a kid reading that, I was like, I don't really like the computer generated Brainiac imagery here, but
No, no. I
but the
mean,
storyline overall, look, it was
yeah,
solid.
yeah, I agree.
Uh, but yeah, no, I know it's a funny thing, and kind of on that note, we were mentioning the Millennium Giants. We do the seeds for that are planted in these issues where archaeologists right across the world are unearthing these dragons' teeth, right? And the legend that's associated with those, and these heralds of the Millennium Giants come forth, and they identify Superman as this anomaly, this power source, and they're able to track him down when he's Clark. They're at Lois and Clark at this costume party, dressed up as Batman and Robin,
Yeah,
and they take him, and Lois is like, "Oh, they must have taken him because they think he's Batman." But I did appreciate, even though I'm kind of dreading the Millennium Giants a little bit, I did appreciate that that's being seeded now throughout, right? It wasn't something that just kind of like came out of nowhere. We were building to
right.
that. But yeah, to your point, yeah, a lot of mentions of the fact that we are approaching the next millennium, and it's like that again, so much time has passed, but I mean, even as a kid, I do remember like it was a big thing, and it's everyone, it's like everyone was, and especially as we got closer and the whole Y2K craze came about. So it definitely was a little bit of a time warp reading these issues.
Yeah, and you tell me if you notice this. So, like, as you read these stories, and it kind of follows the pattern that most, if not Superman, a lot of the, you know, tent pole characters go through. They expand and contract, especially they contract at these pivotal, milestone issues. So we were creeping up to, what is it, 80th anniversary of Superman.
Now we're in the 85th.
The now we're in 85th,
Yeah.
but what was the issue? Was it oh, crap? No, it was 60, right? 60 years
So
when
with Superman
at the
Forever,
yes.
yes, that was 60.
That was 60. Okay. So, obviously they wanted to have everything kind of familiar back to the way it was. So, okay, Jimmy Olsen was professionally, he was kind of growing, but they need to rein him back in. Okay. And then they're going to make all these other characters kind of go away for a little while, all these ancillary characters. And then obviously Superman with his powers and all that sort of thing. So it all just expands and contracts and comes back to normal for a period of time and then blows up again. So, yeah.
It's true. It's like the more time we spend with this, the more the more you see that play out. I mean, very recently we talking about current events in the Superman books. We covered Action 1050, which put that genie back in the bottle as far as the secret identity. And it's like, that was, even though it was kind of irrelevant since Superman was off world for almost the entire time that his identity was public, which
Right.
is fine by me. I was not a fan of that revelation, but yeah, it's like, we're kind of centering back right on our status quo. But yeah, I mean, Jurgens even mentioned that in that interview, or maybe that even came up in. No, I think that came up in old Wizard articles that I read where they were interviewing the creative teams about the Electric Saga. And one of them even mentioned, like, we're coming up on the 60th anniversary. And, they didn't say it explicitly, but basically it was like, hey, things will be okay by the time we get there. So that's certainly how it played out. As far as the Lex of it all goes, I guess the other major development, and again, Superman number 131 by Jurgens and Frenz. Like, if you read one issue from this, honestly, I would say the Batman issue with the Kryptonite ring and Superman 131 for me were probably my two favorite single issues. Adventures, what was it, 550, the anniversary issue? That was a solid one too, I thought.
Yeah, and the Mixie issue.
I was not as into that. I know I was not as into that, but
I can understand
that
the art was not good, for reasons we've discussed in the past, but I always find that character fun as hell because it just pokes at fun at things that happened previously.
In that issue's defense, so it was Man of Steel 75, so playing up on the 75 significance, right? Yeah, they did the whole death of Mixie. And you look at the cover, and it's a play on Superman 75, right. And so instead of Superman's cape, it's Mixie's underwear. It's like it's fun.
Right.
It's fun. So I appreciated, sort of making the most out of the significance of the number. And the other thing too, though, to the issue's credit, at least we got Mixie. At least we got a recognizable core traditional Superman villain. And I've talked about this before. I really do admire the fact that these creators try to add. They really try to expand the rogues gallery. At the same time, Ripper, Savior, Barrage, Rock, Misa, like a lot of these characters that get play during these issues that we read. I mean, I don't know were there any of these new villains that really popped for you, or were you sort of like,
no, none of them, really popped. And their designs, I didn't find them to be too original. They seem to be like alternate versions of other characters, and I'm bad with names, but there's one crud. Mainframe, is it? No, it's not Mainframe. Yeah. I mean, he is one, but there's one of them that has a very similar look to Darkseid. He's got the headpiece around his head, bulky armor, and it's derivative of other characters, I thought. So, none of these villains really jumped out at me as any with real staying power. I mean, Savior was the only one that's been around, for a few years now, and he just keeps rehashing the same nonsense. But I will say that him being in the issue that he was kind of made a little bit more sense because, he sees Superman in his current state, and then Scorn in Superman's outfit, and you guys are just imposters, or if that's how you're going to be, I could look that way too. And all of a sudden he thinks up a new funky outfit. So it didn't bother me so much as it did in the past.
Yeah, fair enough. And that the Savior thing, yeah, like with the two deceivers as he calls them, that certainly worked well enough. But yeah, I mean, I think it probably says a lot that these villains have not stood the test of time.
No.
Right? If there were more to work with there, I'm sure they'd be dusted off and utilized again, and that hasn't happened. And so I guess, and like I said, I don't mean to, just be piling on here. I really do want to stress I enjoyed the reading. And that's the thing,
I do
that overall, and I've said this a lot. I mean, other times I've said it in the context of really enjoying it. Here, there were some roadblocks to total enjoyment, but like these books, the level of consistency that these creative teams had and cohesiveness right across the books, they were always very readable, in you know, to varying degrees, but always enjoyable to some extent. And there were very few instances where I was like, oh man, that issue was such a slog to get through. Almost never, right?
Right.
In terms of how compelling they were, it varied. And I just think that in this round of issues in particular, it was just kind of a tough mix of getting a little bit sick of the explanation of the new powers and so much time with characters like Scorn and Ashbury, and the fact that almost all of the villains were from this newer, less effective crop. I think one of those things by itself would have been, but I think it was the fact that a lot of those things were kind of swirling around,
Mhm.
sort of hindered the enjoyment a little bit. But they're still very readable. They were, I would still recommend this era to someone. Maybe not someone starting from scratch as a Superman fan, but for someone who is any level of Superman fan and like hasn't mined this period of the character's history, I would still recommend it. So.
Absolutely. It look, Superman is great, and like you said, we are looking at it through different lens than we did originally. Um, I know that at the time, for as much as I didn't particularly wasn't my favorite period, I was literally rushing to get the next issue. I wanted to see what was going to happen, as does everyone who's a comic book fan. And whether you hate or love the current storyline, you want to see what's going to happen next. So, now I look at it as one big cohesive story that I can read, in a week versus over months. Um, and I enjoy reading it, but now I could sit back and kind of analyze it a little bit more. It's like when I equate it to when I see any comic book movie. The first viewing is always like, for the most part, like, oh, this is cool. And then it's usually my drive home where I'm thinking about it and I'm like, huh, not so much. Or like my second viewing and I'm I'm like, this is kind of not making sense. Like, why is this? And they made some decisions here that weren't right? So that's kind of how I equate it to. And of course now I'm much older. I'm like, oh, stupid man.
Yeah, now it's like yeah. I don't find myself getting as worked up about too much, as often these days because
Yeah.
it's other things to worry about, I guess. And it's just sort of like, it'll be.
Right.
We've been like down these roads so many times where it's like, it'll be okay.
Yeah, exactly. And look, this is a character at this point, at least, that had been around for 60 years. How do you make, fresh, new, groundbreaking issues? It's hard. It's hard. I don't care, I mean, who's the writer or the artists. It's not easy. And I'm sure anyone who's writing them now is, I will say there's, some pretty good writers rocking it now, but I'm sure it's intimidating for them.
And in fairness, I mean, I agree. I think the books currently are as strong as they've been in a really, really long time.
Yeah.
Really liking Philip Kennedy Johnson on action.
Yeah.
As of this recording, I'm really excited to see what Josh Williamson does on the Superman title. Big fan of Tom Taylor. I just read all of Son of Kal-El. I'm looking forward to the new John Kent series. So there's great stuff. But in fairness, I guess to the '90s creators, like the current creators do have the benefit of they're doing great work, but they do have the benefit of John Kent, right? Like this is this major
Yes.
forward movement in the mythology. There's new material to explore here.
Hmm.
So kind of rolling it back to the mid to late '90s here, where we're in the status quo, and it's like within that, what can you do? You has to be married off the characters, and that gives us some new angles to play. But really, on that week to week basis, it's like you gotta come up with stuff. If this story had been 12 issues or even 20 issues,
Yeah.
I think it would have played out a lot differently, and I think it would have been more effective and would be remembered more fondly. I think it was
Hmm.
just like Jurgens said in the interview. I think it went on a little bit too long, got a little bit unwieldy without really enough places to go. But I want to just before we sort of wind down, I know we've touched on the Jimmy Olsen of it all. But I mean, what did you make of his fall from grace here? He really has, you feel for the, or I don't know, do you feel for the character? Because there are points where it might be hard to have some sympathy for him.
I don't feel for Jim. No, Jimmy is a polarizing character. Um, so Jimmy has a place in Superman history, and it's more or less been the same forever, and with some tweaks here and there. So I was kind of liking the fact that they were making him a little bit more of a serious character. He's like, I'm going to be like, the hard hitting reporter. I'm going to get my story, and it's going to be on the news, and that's what. No, okay, go back to taking pictures, buddy. Like it's yeah. I was bummed to see the character, again gaining momentum and then lose it. For as much as I find him to be goofy as all sin. But I like to see characters evolve and change a bit, which is why I think the new stuff is really cool, because in the period of time that John Kent has been around, he's grown quite a bit. So I like to see that happen with characters, and Jimmy had that. So to see him lose it, it's a bummer. But like you kind of know, like he's a core character. He has his place. So for as much as they're going to change him, make him grow, he at some point he's going back to his spot in ranking.
Yes, very true. And, the other thing that I know we're building towards is Lex buying and closing the Daily Planet.
Mm-hmm.
So that's still to come. And if memory serves, I think Jimmy gets his job back, and then like almost instantly the planet is shut. If I'm remembering correctly, but we'll get there. But I really did enjoy his arc here. I didn't, I've always been a Jimmy fan, and I liked that. I just felt like it was kind of interesting, like a more sophisticated material to sort of dive into with him. So in the last episode, we talked about Jimmy's report on Superman's new powers, which Metallo used to his advantage in battle. So we have that as sort of our background here. Again, he's Mr. Action. He's on air reporting for GBS, reporting to Cat Grant, who not a great influence. I typically I've been a fan and a defender of Cat. I don't know. Maybe to some extent she's looking out for Jimmy, but I don't know. I feel like in these issues in particular, I don't think she's a great influence, and I don't think she's looking out for him.
I wouldn't say so. No, I don't. At least I don't really see that happening so much. But she's another one of those like ancillary characters that doesn't really she hasn't really had much room to spread her wings so much um in this set of stories.
Yeah, I mean, look, it ebbs and flows with all of them. We talked about it. I always felt that the loss of her son, right? I felt like they could and should have done more with her in the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
And then later on, to see her at GBS and to see her contending with, the sexual harassment, right, of Vinny Edge, and then ousting him and all, like that was a great moment for her. Again, I don't know how great she comes off in this round of issues, and so I don't know. I think it's not consistent necessarily, I guess, when it comes to her character, but I do still remain a fan generally. But yeah, I mean, as far as Jim, so heading into this, he's kind of grappling with the fact that he hurt his pal right through his report, but Kat tells him like the ratings were, the ratings were there. People are excited. They're going to air the actual interview with Hamilton talking about the powers. And so, this kind of snowballs to the point where Bibbo Babowski clocks Jimmy on the air. Right. And then poor Bibbo, so racked with guilt over this, for using his abilities, to fight someone who didn't ask for it, renounces his heavyweight title, in the boxing world. I will always love Bibbo. And then Jim's next big idea is, we mentioned that fire that Intergang sets at Lois and Clark's apartment building. And so, he gets this shot of one of the other residents in the building, who's a former football player, carrying Clark out of the building, and Colin Thornton, who we know is Satanus, he's standing there. And Jim takes his photo, and we come to learn Jim is convinced that one of these guys is Superman, and he's going to have this special report revealing the identity to the world. And this was one of those things, talk about like memories of being a kid. I remember, like, this came right back to, I remember being a kid and reading this and being like, who does Jimmy think it is? Like, I was really pulled into this as a kid. Spoiler alert, he thinks it's Colin Thornton, which is,
and he's about to open the, that was the panel where he's about to open the phone booth. And it was at that one, or maybe I got it mixed up, but I know there is one where he's about to like blow the, kind of, reveal the identity as Superman, and he goes to open up the telephone booth door, and it was what's his name? Christ, I'm so bad with names.
One of the three contenders, or
yeah.
Well, so I forget the football player's name, and then Colin Thornton.
Yeah, I think it was Colin Thornton, and he was like, "Oh, but it was," and he thought it was like Clark, and he's like, "Oh no," but
yeah, and so I guess what I appreciated about this was that he did struggle with this a little bit, right? He went to Lois and Clark. He doesn't tell them what the exact context of the dilemma is,
right.
But basically, like, I have this big story. What should I do?
Right.
And they basically encourage him to do it. I mean, I don't know. I do feel for Jim to an extent in all of this. I think he is being jerked around a bit, and especially at GBS, like, he's being pushed in this direction. And I think, when he seeks out the council, right, of people he respects, yes, he's not painting the full picture for them, I suppose, but still at the heart of it, it's like he has newsworthy information. What should he do with it? And they give him the advice, and he, proceeds.
You should run with it, Jim. It's your duty as a reporter to report the news. By the way, I'm going to ruin your life with this news.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you do feel for him for a bit. But ultimately, what I love the most is that he does come around, right? And he doesn't go through with it because, he invites the three contenders onto the program, and he's interviewing Clark about Superman. And, Clark's talking about what Superman means, what Superman represents, the fact that Superman doesn't do what he does for the recognition, right? It's just to help. And if there's anything that would hurt someone, he won't do it. And that really gets through to Jim. And so Jim throws the special, and he's like, the secret is Superman has no secret identity. And that ends his career. Like, he's fired. So, he does the right thing in the end. I did like that in the opening sequence of his special, it's taken verbatim, but tweaked for the modern era. The opening from the Adventures of Superman TV series, right down to Superman standing there, in space on them. Very, very cool. I was happy to see that. I don't buy that the network wouldn't know what he was going to reveal, right?
Yeah, that would never, never, ever, ever happen. Like, they would, in no world would that ever happen. I mean, that would have, like, everyone up the chain would have seen that at some point a few times and discussed it. I mean, look, law, that's not how it would happen. So, I mean, every lawyer in the building who has read any law book would have been like, are we sure? And if you don't report this, you're dead. Like, that's basically, they wouldn't just, it's not like, like, oh, I have the scoop and we don't have time to review it, like, go live. Like, well, what are you saying? Like, oh, I'm going to tell you that J. Edgar Hoover is actually gay, and we're going to announce it. Like, what?
Yeah, like, that was just, I could not buy that. I mean, like I said, I like that they gave him this crisis of conscience, and that he ultimately does the right thing. And again, he loses his job, and then Intergang comes after him, and he hits the road. Bibbo is like, take my motorcycle. He's leaving town, and that's when he gets mixed up with the wild area and that whole crew. But on the other hand, is it a bridge too far? Like, can you forgive Jimmy for being willing, I mean, more than willing, like, eager to reveal what he thought was Superman's secret identity. Because again, it's one thing, that initial report about Superman's new powers, right? Like he didn't realize the effect that that was having, that Metallo was using it. So I can, you can chalk that up to, all right, he was ignorant, he got caught up. But this, I don't know. I've been defending Jimmy, but I don't know. That's a
I
little
don't
tough to
think
get
I
past.
could. I don't think I could, only because you know the type of character Jimmy is. He has stood by Clark and Superman, not knowing who each, that they are the same person over the years. He's quite literally put his life on the line for either one of them. So for him to have some, change of conscience and be willing to turn them in, so to speak, and reveal their secret identity, I I I wouldn't forgive a character like that. If it were any other character, it would totally make sense. But it doesn't make sense for him. Like he is, Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. Like he's got the secret watch. So, he will, Superman doesn't give that to everyone. So it it would be very much out of character for him to do that. If they were to do that, it would have to be some they would have to change the character in such a way where it's not just his career is building up, it's not like he got a promotion. They would have to change the core of the character, which they didn't do. They just gave him a different job, but they would have to be like a la Ted Lasso, where Nate was Ted Lasso's like little like pet, loved him to death, and basically changed on a dime because he felt he was getting the short end of the stick, and now he's like the quote unquote villain. So they would have to do that to Jimmy Olsen to make him really do that, and for him to do it and not do that, it would be, you couldn't forgive him. I don't think.
Agreed. The other thing, it's the last thing I'll say on Jimmy, as we wrap up, is it would have been interesting if he had thought Clark was Superman, because like it's hard enough to get past that he would reveal Superman's identity at all, right? Because he has this relationship with Superman.
Mm-hmm.
It's so that in of itself might just be unforgivable, but it's a little bit more understandable if he thinks it's Colin Thornton, right? He does not have that relationship with Colin. Like there's no
Right.
loyalty to that person. I do wonder what he would have done. And I hope that he wouldn't have even entertained it at all if he had thought Clark was Superman. Because now it's not just, the Superman of it all. It's like, well, he also has a relationship with the person on the other side of Superman.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, it would have been interesting to see like what he would have done in that kind of instance. But I don't know. Overall, I was happy to see Jimmy get this play. And like I said, between Jimmy and Lex, I thought that was kind of where this batch of issues was the strongest. Like we were focusing on the characters that, we kind of care the most about. And I think that, they had some interesting stuff to do. And I think those were the highlights for me. Is there anything else we have not talked about, either big picture or specific issues or moments or anything like that we haven't talked about that you wanted to?
No, we discussed my Man of Tomorrow issue, which I adore. No, not so much, because the next it's out in the next section of stories where we get Maxima. Just because I like that character. So I always enjoyed her in the stories. She was always interesting to throw in there. But I don't know. I think everything that we've discussed is kind of what I had in mind here. Yeah, Parasite, Cyborg, and then in my notes I had Atom, Mixoplick, and Batman. So yeah.
Right on. Well, listen, I know this was not not as long, I guess, as the last reading assignment, but it's still a decent amount of issues. So I do appreciate you reading and coming on and having this conversation. I really enjoyed it. It's, going back to these issues for the first time, right, since I was a kid, and especially this period, and just kind of reevaluating it. It's been a fascinating process. And again, we're far from done, but I think this sort of brings to a close, the first major round, certainly of the Electric Superman saga, and there's still more to go as far as the late '90s period in the Triangle era. But fascinating, just a fascinating process, and I think I feel like I have a good handle on this era now in a way that I didn't before, where I know what I liked, but I also know where I think this sort of fell apart a little bit, and we talked about it, but yeah, just always kind of interesting to dive back in. So I thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. I got to kind of revisit the gimmicky covers again. So, we were during the 90s, crazy covers were a big thing, variants and chrome and lenticular versions and whatnot. And then it kind of chilled out for a while. But this series, there was a lot of different types of like gimmicky versions. So we had like the headshots. We had the glow in the dark, obviously the main glow in the dark issue where his powers changed, the debut of that. We had a lot of plays on old themes of covers, which I appreciated, like Scorn and the classic Action Comics cover. And then obviously where he splits, and that was a 3D, the red and blue 3D, which is always terrible version. So scanning through those versions of the gimmicky covers, I always get a kick out of. And showing my son, he was like, "What is this about, Daddy?"
It's funny you say that because like I said, I've been reading on my iPad, and so my 3.5-year-old, he's seen me reading a bunch of times, and he's been very interested, which delights me to no end.
Yeah,
And like we've scrolled through a few issues, and it's just he's like, "Who is that?" I'm like, "That's Superman." He's like, "Why is he blue?" And I'm like, "Oh God, buddy, where
right.
do I start?"
Yeah. Well, you see, oh my
He
God,
was in the sun. That's all you need to
yeah,
know.
yeah. He got a
Uncle,
really
yeah,
bad sunburn, and
Uncle Joe said he was in the sun, and that's what happened. So that's fine.
yeah, and I think you're in a really great point being a father, and you can, because I went through the same thing with my son, is just opening up his eyes to all that is Superman, and hoping to God he appreciates it.
There's definitely that recognition and that excitement when he sees the character, and so we will try to nurture that.
Yeah,
But with a very light touch. It's like if he,
very light touch. Don't
it's
do
not
like I
yeah.
did. Don't overwhelm him because he'll just go Marvel on your ass. That's
Oh man,
he is all Spider-Man, which is fine. But don't get me
yes.
wrong, it's fine. But I was always like, "How about Superman? How about Superman? You want to watch Superman? You want to listen to Superman?" Whatever. He's like, "No, can you put on Spider-Verse again?" I'm like, "Okay."
Just as a side note, because I mentioned this last week too, my Superman Red Electric Funko Pop came. So for people who are on
See,
YouTube,
right
if you
behind you.
look over my shoulder, I now have both of them. So the
That's
set
awesome.
is there, and when we dive into Superman Red and Blue in a couple of episodes, it'll be appropriate for that. So Dollar Bin Bandits podcast available on
Yes.
YouTube, on all major podcast platforms, on social media. You guys interview
Yep.
veteran comics creators, really in-depth conversations with people who, maybe haven't necessarily had the spotlight on them recently, right? But have contributed so much to these characters and books that we love so much. Is there anything in particular you want to share? Any recent or upcoming episodes that you want to direct people to?
I am. So we have our calendar pretty planned out in advance till around April, and we have some really great guests coming on. We just found out we're going to be, after probably a year and a half trying to get him, going to have Larry Hama on our show. We're also, and as I say this, I'm still getting goosebumps. We're going to have Jeff Johns on.
Oh,
Dude, damn it. I just said it and I gave myself goosebumps. I am beyond excited. We haven't interviewed him yet, but it's on the schedule
that's a
for
big get,
March.
man. Congrats.
Holy crap, Ed, you have no idea. I am beyond thrilled for that. So I'm making sure I just Green Lantern the hell out of my back shelf here. But yeah, that's a big one. We also have a couple of quote unquote panels. We're gonna have Ron Lim and Ron Frenz. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, Ron Lim and Ron Frenz on again. And we have a bigger panel planned for April, but I can't really say it because until it actually comes together. But the goal is we're having 4 creators on in addition to the 3 of us. So that's going to either go really, really well or not at all. So we'll see.
Well, I'm sure it'll be great. Well, I can't wait to check them out. Kudos on what you've done and what you have lined up. I hope people will check out Dollar Bin Bandits. And we mentioned this when you were on the show before, but you've had a bunch of the Superman creators whose work we have discussed.
Yes.
You've had them on. So I hope people will check out the show generally, and in particular, especially for our Superman fans who are listening here, we'll check out those the Superman creator interviews in particular.
Thank you. And please, hey, keep doing all your awesome Superman work beyond just the Triangle era. I mean, I keep spreading the word about what you do. I love Superman, but your appreciation and fondness and love for Superman just trumps anything I've ever seen. So keep kicking the ass and doing the Lord's work, as they say.
It's very kind. I appreciate that. I continue to love doing this, and so as long as I do, we'll keep going. So
I wish I had the time to devote to do it as much as you do.
It's become a lot to juggle, but as with anything, it's like when when the passion is there, it's like you make it work, right? And that's the thing. And so we will we'll keep this never-ending battle going. So
Awesome.
Again, thank you very much. Thank you, audience. As always appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back next week for part 3 of Electric Til 1 Million. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.